Hi, Bill Barber from Poliigon here. In this video we'll be looking at how to properly make use of a displacement texture in 3ds Max with Corona. Before we get started, let's take a look at the material we'll be using. It's ground asphalt broken 001 and is easily one of my favourite ground textures here at Poliigon. It's brilliant for demonstrating this displacement, which is why I picked it. I've already got the 4K version saved to my hard drive and I'll include a link below the video. As a note, I would recommend getting the 4K version if you're going to be following along, because with displacement you really do want as much detail from the texture as possible. So let's take a look at what it is we're going to be doing. You've probably heard of a bump map before, which is used to artificially give the impression of height in a material. Well, a displacement map is different. It is used to literally deform the object based on the values of the texture, with the black areas being the deep crevices and the white areas being the peaks. It results in a far more realistic material. Okay, so let's look at recreating this effect with Corona. We've got a basic scene here, just a plane and a camera and a HDR lighting setup, and that is about it. And we'll start by bringing in the material that we'll be using. So let's go over to the material converter. Now I've covered the usage of this in a previous video, which I'll link below this one. But for now, let's just scroll down and find, there it is, ground asphalt broken. Now, I've got a little green tick there, but that's just because I brought this in previously when testing out these settings. You won't see that on yours. But anyway, let's load that in. And it'll say it's been done successfully. Then we can jump over to the material editor. Make sure that we've got our plane selected. Now we'll drag the material onto the slate editor like so. Right mouse button on the material and assign it. There we go. Now you can see here that the converters brought in our various maps. We've got our color related ones there, reflection, gloss, normals, and a displacement map. Good. So it's done most of the work for us. So let's give that a render now and see what we get by default. And right off the bat, it actually looks pretty good. You hear I sound surprised. With the majority of renderers, the default displacement settings aren't particularly great, and you do have quite a few adjustments to make. But with Corona, the default settings actually work pretty well. However, there are some adjustments we can make, so let's take a look at those. First of all, I'm going to jump over to our plane here. Our modifier list here. I'm also going to open up the material converter. So if we look at the shader itself, we have some controls here that are inputted by default. The min and max level for the displacement is just here, which for a lot of scenes will be perfectly fine. You could just leave that on the default setting. What I am going to do though is also add in a Corona displacement mod. There it is. Corona displacement modifier. And that gives us the same controls as we've got over here. So it kind of overrides the material settings, but it allows us a little bit more control. So by default, that the material was set to 0.025. So I've now replicated that here. But now we have the option to increase it, and you could do that from the material itself, but the reason I'm using the modifier, I'm going to go a bit more extreme, let's say 0.04, but the reason I want to use this is because you also get this subdivision override, yeah, and that allows you to dictate the quality of the subdivision. Now the more subdivision you have, the more the more geometry the displacement has to work with, the better results you will get. Now by default this is using a pixel rate of 2. Now the way subdivision works in terms of pixels, in fact it's got a good description of it here. When selected, displacement tessellation will be performed adaptively in the screen space. Now what that basically means is pixels closer, or geometry closer to the camera will get subdivided more than stuff that's further away. Rather than doing a sort of generic displacement or subdivision on the entire mesh, it will adaptively do it depending on how close the camera is to it. Basically meaning that it saves a lot of memory. So the lower you set this value, the higher the subdivision will be. Yeah. Now, if you were to go for a value like 1, you probably max out your memory and not even be able to render the scene. I think a value of around 2, maybe 2.5 will work well for this, because this is quite a detailed sort of displacement. For other things you could get away with considerably less. So let's, now we've made a few adjustments, let's hit render again and see what we get. Okay, so I've actually gone a little bit too extreme with the number there. These high peaks here aren't really supposed to be, that doesn't really look quite right. But what we can see is increasing the division by lowering that pixel value has given us way more geometry to work in the foreground here. So basically it's a matter of balancing the subdivision and the strength of the displacement, depending on the material you're using. Now I picked this one because it's quite an extreme example. You really want it to be displaced all over the place. For materials like wooden floors and tiles and whatnot, obviously you'd scale that down quite considerably. But yeah, Corona certainly does make it very easy. So in summary, we've taken our material from Poliigon.com, brought it into 3ds Max, played with the displacement modifier, affected the level of tessellation and the strength of the displacement to get the desired result, finally rendering it out in Corona.